All right, everyone. So we are going to start talking about the elements of plot. So whether you're writing a story or reading a story, you do need to understand the elements of plot and how they function together to make a story. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that way you guys can see the presentation. I will also have it linked and available to you on Echo. So we have the elements of plot, and you'll notice this kind of looks like a mountain. It starts at the bottom, goes up to the point, comes back down and around. So that's always the visual that I use when I'm thinking about it. So we have 5 elements of plot, and you'll see just right on this front screen: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So we're going to go through each of these. We always start off with our exposition. So I have 2 different definitions on each of these slides, just so that one definition might work better for you as opposed to somebody else. So exposition. This usually occurs at the beginning of a short story. Here the characters are introduced. We also learn about the setting of the story. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or the main problem. So with the exposition, it does start at the beginning. We're able to identify the setting, so when and where the story is taking place, who our main characters are, our main conflict or our problem. And we might have some mini conflicts as well. So we aren't able to fully understand the problem in the story yet, but it's there, just a little bit of it. So then we go into the rising action. Now the rising action does take up majority of the story itself, whether you're writing it or you're reading it. So the rising action is the part of the story that begins to develop the conflict or the conflicts. It's a building of interest or suspense that occurs, okay? So it's rising us up to our climax, which we're gonna talk about in just a second. But the rising action includes the mini conflicts that contribute to a rise in action. So these are the conversations that are happening. These are the things that we're finding out about our characters, or things with our setting, or maybe with our conflict. So they're kind of baby steps that are building us up to what we call our climax. So it's the high point of the story. The climax refers to the most exciting part of a story where most of the action takes place. The action can also be considered the crisis of the story. So when we think about the climax, we're at the very top of that mountain, okay? And at the top of that mountain, we've had all of that build up. So it's leading us to like our aha moment, that most exciting, the most suspenseful. Okay, so whether you're reading a story or writing a story, when we think of the climax, we're kind of thinking of the dun dun dun, what's gonna happen part. So after that takes place, we start to come down that side of the mountain, okay, with the falling action. So these are all of the events that happen after the climax. These are the events that lead us towards a resolution. So I have a little example on the side. Justin learned to study with his sister. Okay, so first thing he studies, he passes his classes, and then he got his GPA up. Okay, so we have Justin learned to study with his sister. So that's part of that rising action. The climax is he passed his classes, he got his GPA up. Okay, so that's part of that falling action. Then we're going to find out at the very end what happens, with that, because he did get his grades up. The falling action also refers to the slowing down of events after the climax. So these trickle down events help the readers to gain closure of a story. Because if we didn't have a falling action, loose ends wouldn't start to come together, and we would be left feeling like, well, what the heck? I don't know what happened with this character. I don't understand what happened with this problem. Okay, so the falling action is pretty important too. Okay, so then we have our resolution. So the resolution is the part of the plot that concludes the falling action by revealing or suggesting the outcome of the conflict. Okay, the resolution of a story is the end of the plot line where conflicts or problems are resolved. So we can think of they lived happily ever after, or he took off never to be seen again. Okay, so we are able to understand what's happening with our conflict as well as with our characters. Okay, so start off with our exposition. We explain when and where the story is taking place, who our characters are, along with part of what that main conflict is. Majority of our story is that rising action. Okay, it's rising up, taking us through the different mini conflicts that are happening, what's happening with the characters, the different settings that are taking place. Okay, all of that build up, which leads us to our aha moment, that climax, the most exciting part of the story, where we're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen. Okay, so it's the exciting part. Maybe it's a battle. Okay, then after that, what happens after that stuff? Okay, so we have this trickle down effect of all of the events that are happening, finally leading us to our resolution. They lived happily ever after, or whatever it may be. Okay, so those are the elements of plot. Every story has one. Whether you're reading it or you're writing it, you do need to be able to identify these elements of plot. Um, and usually when I have students write stories, which I was going to have you guys do, I give you a plot diagram that kind of like it looks like the mountain, and you would be filling in all of the different things. Okay, so anytime you do write a a short story, I'm not talking about the 24 word short stories or the 36 word short stories I have you guys write, but if you were to write maybe a 5 to 10 page short story, you still need to remember that you would have to follow these elements of plot, fill them in, outline it, so that way it becomes easier for you as you start to write. Okay, a couple other things that we do need to talk about. Theme. So a theme is present in every story, again, whether you're reading it or you're writing it. Okay, the theme is a central message, what the author wants you to learn or to know, and it's usually a broad idea about life. It's usually not stated and must be inferred. So depending on the story and depending on what the author wants us to understand, it might be a lesson on lying isn't good, or don't judge a book by its cover. Okay, it's usually developed indirectly, which means the author doesn't come out and say the theme of the story is. Okay, so another definition with some examples, it's usually that moral message, something that pertains to our life. What can we get out of this? So for example, in the movie Pinocchio, the theme is that dishonesty will not provide you with rewards, right? We know that Pinocchio consistently lies, and things tend to get worse for him because of that. Another example in the novel Brian's Winter, the central theme would be survival and what Brian does throughout the winter in order to survive. Okay, so the theme is different in every story that you read or write. Okay, and finally, we're going to talk about mood. And mood is exactly what it says. It's the feeling of the story. It's how the author wants you to feel after reading it. Okay, so maybe if it's a sci-fi story, you might be kind of intrigued, or if it's a horror story, you might feel frightened, or if it's a romance, you might feel that enamored feeling, or if it's just a fiction story, if something sad happens, right? So the mood is just how we're feeling after reading the story. So this is an introduction to reading a novel and developing those elements of plot, and also for writing stories as well. So be thinking about this, and maybe on some of your spare time, which I know you guys have, you guys can start to develop some stories. And feel free to email me if you're struggling with a topic. I'd be happy to give you one. It's not something that you would have to submit to me unless you wanted me to read it, and I could give you some feedback. But these are things that we were going to be covering in school anyway, so I wanted to hop on here and show it to you guys. So just know that some of the videos I'm going to be providing will look like this, where I'll be a little box up in the corner, and you'll see the presentation, or I might just do some screencasts where you just see the screen without me on there. Okay, all right, hang in there, guys. Miss you. Let me figure this out. Stop share. All right, bye guys.